The man known to history as Rudolf Hess was born on the 26th of April 1894 in Ibrahimia, a suburb of the city of Alexandria in the Nile Delta of northern Egypt. His father was Johann Fritz Hess, the owner of Hess & Company, a large import-export business which shipped goods from Egypt to Germany, and had been founded in the 1860s to benefit from the new trade routes established by the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and negating the need for ships to travel around Africa to get from Europe to Asia. Rudolf's mother was Clara Hess, the daughter of a wealthy textile industrialist in Germany who had met Johann as a result of their respective families' business interests. Rudolf was their first child. Two others followed, a boy, Alfred, in 1897, and a girl, Margareta, after a long interval of 11 years in 1908. Rudolf was born in Egypt at an unusual time in the country's history. It had been a province of the Ottoman Empire for over 300 years, but during the course of the mid-19th century, Britain had gradually begun to unofficially take over Egypt in advance of the construction of the Suez Canal, a major project which was necessary for Britain to improve communications between London and the jewel of its empire, the British Raj of India. Thus, Hess effectively grew up in a British protectorate. Following the completion of the canal in 1869, many expat communities of merchants and traders from European countries popped up here, and the German community was significant enough in Alexandria that Hess was able to attend a German-language Protestant school there during his youth. His youth was formative and left him convinced of the racial superiority of people from countries like Germany and Britain, without whom Hess believed Egypt would be mired in pre-modern stagnation. He had already adopted that view by his teenage years, at which time he was sent to Switzerland by his father to begin studying economics and finance, with a view to taking over the family business in due course. He studied there for a year between 1911 and 1912, before heading to Germany to take up an apprenticeship in the city of Hamburg. While Rudolf was growing up in Egypt, Europe was becoming a place of growing tension. The German state had only recently come into existence. Prior to 1871, when the new German Empire was formed, Germany was a region made up of a few dozen smaller states, of which the largest was Prussia. When they were united in 1871, it upset the economic and political balance of Europe and Britain, but others were also perturbed by Germany's growing power. As a result, the European powers began dividing into two armed military alliances from the 1880s onwards, one centered on Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the other comprising Britain, France, and Russia. Years of escalating tension caused by military, economic, and colonial rivalry, as well as competition for land in regions such as the Balkans, saw the European diplomatic situation deteriorate precipitously. Then, in the summer of 1914, the heir to the throne of the Empire of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist in the streets of Sarajevo, and the political crisis which ensued slowly escalated over a 5-week period until all of the major European powers declared war on each other by early August 1914. It was the beginning of the First World War, and a series of events which would have an enormous impact on Hess's life. At the time of the outbreak of the First World War, Hess was 20 years old and living in Germany, learning the family business. Within weeks, he had enlisted in the 7th Bavarian Field Artillery Regiment. His wartime service was extensive. For instance, he was soon involved in the First Battle of Ypres in the late autumn and early winter of 1914, one of the first major battles on the Western Front in northwestern France and Belgium, a region that would become the crucible of the entire war. He was soon earning promotions and awards for distinguished service, receiving the Iron Cross and being promoted to colonel in 1915. He then served at the bloody Battle of Verdun in France, which dragged on for most of 1916, before being posted to the Romanian front in the Balkans theatre in 1917. Throughout these periods of service, he was injured on several occasions, being hit by shrapnel multiple times, though these injuries were not extensive, and he was soon back in service after a few weeks' convalescence. By 1918, he had determined to become a fighter pilot in the new field of aviation combat, but by then the war had swung dramatically against Germany, following the entry of the United States on Britain and France's side. And in early November 1918, as supply shortages and political unrest ravaged Germany internally, the country was forced to surrender to the British, French, and US. The war was over, but the political scars which it created would continue to have drastic consequences for Europe. In the aftermath of the First World War, Germany entered a period of pronounced turmoil. In the closing stages of the war, Germany's imperial ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had abdicated. A German republic, named after the town its representatives first met in, Weimar, was declared, but the country was completely unstable for the 2 years that followed. For instance, German socialists and communists, who were inspired by the communist revolution that had occurred in Russia in 1917, began launching insurrections themselves in cities such as Berlin and Munich across Germany. On the other side of the political spectrum, right-wing nationalists were determined to prevent the left-wing socialists seizing power and were also bitter about the result of the war. The problem was compounded as the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded the war in 1919, restricted Germany to having an army of 100,000 men. As a consequence of this, hundreds of thousands of German men, who otherwise would have remained in the military after the war ended, were demobilized. They began joining right-wing paramilitary organizations such as the Freikorps or Free Corps, which were engaging in running street battles against communists and other groups across Germany in 1919. In time, these gave way to new political groups, which were based on the idea of refuting Germany's post-war position and also finding scapegoats within German society to blame for the country losing the war. Many of these focused on the Jewish people as being responsible at a time when anti-Semitism was rife across nearly all of Europe. Hess soon became one of these young German men entering into extremist politics. He was discharged from the German army within weeks of the war ending, while he was further disillusioned by the collapse of the family business, which had been largely taken over by the British administration in Egypt during the war. Embittered, he gravitated towards both the Freikorps and the Tüler Society in early 1919, the latter of which was a new political group that was rabidly anti-Semitic and committed to the idea of resurrecting a sort of medieval German state which would dominate much of Central and Eastern Europe. By the beginning of the spring of 1919, he was active in both organizations in the Bavaria region of southern Germany, particularly in the regional capital of Munich, where there was a quasi-political war in process between right-wing groups such as the Freikorps and left-wing socialists who wanted to establish a communist state along the lines of that which was being fashioned in Russia following a political revolution there in 1917. Thus, Hess was involved in clashes between paramilitaries here in the spring and early summer of 1919. It was a formative period which would fashion Hess's political ideology as both a right-wing nationalist and as a committed anti-Semite. Germany's politics began to settle down eventually, as the new republic gained control of the situation in cities like Berlin, which had experienced its own attempted socialist coup in the Spartacist uprising of January 1919. As it did, the country began to prosper and enter a period of cultural vitality in the 1920s. However, the politics of Bavaria, and Munich in particular, continued to have an extreme edge to it. Out of the movements, such as those of the Tüler Society and the Freikorps, a new right-wing party emerged there in February 1920. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, known more widely as the Nazi Party, was anti-Semitic, zealously nationalist, and committed to reversing the humiliation which its members believed had been inflicted on Germany according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hess had enrolled in the University of Munich in 1919 and had been influenced while there by the teachings of Karl Haushofer, a professor of geopolitics who advocated for the idea that Germany should rejuvenate itself in the aftermath of the war by initiating new conflicts to acquire extensive Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe. he soon joined the Nazis and would bring this idea to the party in due course. Hess's private life also changed during these years. In the spring of 1920, while he was still studying at the University of Munich, he had met a fellow student by the name of Ilse Prohl. They soon began seeing each other, but it would be 7.5 years before they were married, an unusually long courtship by the standards of the 1920s. Moreover, even when they did marry, they did not start a family for another decade, and it was not until 1937 that Rudolf and Ilse would have their one and only child, a boy named Wolf Hess. If Hess's family life was limited, it was perhaps because he had become so devoted to the Nazi cause during the early 1920s in ways which would hinder his relationship with Ilse, although she shared his politics. Around the time he met his future wife, Hess had also heard a rising member of the Nazi Party, an Austrian veteran of the German army, Adolf Hitler, speak at a political meeting for the first time. Hess was impressed by his fiery rhetoric. So too were many others, and shortly afterwards Hitler rose to become the leader of the party, replacing its first chairman, Anton Drexler, in 1921. Hess soon struck up a close relationship with Hitler, one that would become very close in the years that followed, and it was through this that Hitler made the concept of acquiring Lebensraum in Eastern Europe central to Nazi ideology. Hess and Hitler's relationship would become closer still in the mid-1920s. This was owing to the events of the early winter of 1923. Between his first rise to power within the party in 1921 and the autumn of 1923, Hitler had become increasingly convinced that the party needed to seize power in Munich through a military coup along the lines of those that had been attempted in many parts of the country in 1919. Thus, in the course of 1923, he and the other senior members of the party began planning an uprising in Munich, one which would be facilitated by the growing paramilitary wing of the Nazis, the Sturmabteilung or SA. The revolt was initiated on the 8th of November 1923, when over 2,000 Nazis and SA members tried to seize key locations in Munich, beginning with the Bürger Bräukeller beer hall in the city. However, the beer hall putsch, as it became known, was a shambles, and within hours the city authorities were able to establish a major police presence in Munich, which brought the city under control. Hitler fled the city, but was arrested 2 days later. Hess, who had been involved during the putsch in detaining city officials outside of Munich, fled in its aftermath, along with many others who had been involved, to Austria, but he was soon convinced to return and face sentencing. In the trials that followed throughout November and December 1923, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a rather lenient punishment for the leader of an attempted coup. Hess was given 18 months. Both men were sent to Landsberg prison in the southwest of Bavaria. The Nazi Party was banned by the state government, but this would prove ineffective. In fact, the period of incarceration proved a formative one in the ascent to power of Hitler and the Nazis. While imprisoned at Landsberg, Hitler began dictating his political manifesto to both Hess and another Nazi member who was sentenced there with them, Emil Maurice. This sprawling, paranoid anti-Semitic treatise was subsequently entitled Mein Kampf, meaning My Struggle, and was published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926. By the time the first volume appeared in print, its author was already a free man. The Bavarian state government, elements of which were sympathetic to the views of the Nazis, decided to release Hitler from Landsberg in mid-December 1924, having only served a year of his sentence. Hess was released 10 days later, and within just 2 months, Hitler had also successfully petitioned the Bavarian government to lift the ban on the Nazis which had been imposed in the aftermath of the beer hall putsch. Thus, somewhat incredibly, these individuals and their party, which had attempted a military coup just over a year earlier, were able to once again go about their business from the spring of 1925 onwards. Hess had become an unofficial secretary to Hitler while incarcerated at Landsberg. This position was formalized in the aftermath of their release, as he was appointed private secretary to the Führer of the party in April 1925. with a fixed salary. It was the beginning of a period in which Hess would become known as Hitler's closest confidant, an individual who the leader always made time for, no matter what else was occurring. Indeed, the Nazis were wallowing in a political wilderness during the second half of the 1920s. The party had decided that they would attempt henceforth to seize power in Germany through the electoral system. But despite retaining a significant base of support in Bavaria and Munich in particular, they remained a party with only very limited support throughout Germany, despite the efforts of individuals such as Joseph Goebbels to establish new branches of the party in Berlin and elsewhere. Looking back today, it is difficult at times to remember what a collection of misfits, failures, and political hacks the Nazi leadership, of which Hess was a part, were in the late 1920s. They would have remained as such, a party with a very small base of support in Bavaria and little else, had it not been for the events of the autumn of 1929. That year, a momentous economic crisis struck the developed world following the collapse of the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City. A catastrophic economic depression followed, one which led to mass unemployment across Europe and the Americas during the early 1930s. In time, it would eventually lead to rapid inflation in some countries and the loss of people's life savings. Germany was particularly badly affected, and as millions of Germans suffered and became despondent, they began to adhere to more extreme political groupings in their country. And as this occurred, the Nazis, who had garnered a tiny percentage of the vote in elections up to that point, gradually became more and more popular. Thus, when Reichstag elections were held in September 1930, the party increased its vote percentage from about 2.5% nationally to over 18%. As a result, Hitler and his adherents claimed 107 seats in the 577-seat Reichstag. It was the beginning of a dreadful political revolution in Germany. Hess continued to acquire greater influence within the Nazi Party as it was beginning to grow massively in popularity in the early 1930s. As the private secretary and spokesperson for Hitler, Hess found himself traveling the country with the Nazi leader as Hitler addressed huge audiences at political rallies across Germany, while the party gained ever more supporters. This placed Hess in a powerful position, where he could effectively control who had access to Hitler, a man fast becoming the most powerful politician in Germany, and one whom many people believed was effectively a chancellor in waiting. As he could ensure individuals access to Hitler, or at least that their message or request for an audience would be passed on to the Führer, Hess developed significant powers of patronage, and all of this began to lead to greater official titles. Eventually, in 1932, he was placed in charge of the party liaison staff, a role which meant that he effectively controlled personal access to Hitler during campaigning, as well as being appointed chairman of the party's Central Political Commission. This meant Hess was largely the senior administrator within the Nazi Party by 1932, although others, such as the head of the SS Heinrich Himmler and the chief propagandist Goebbels, did admittedly have more control over policy matters. Hess was about to ascend to a position of considerable significance within Germany. This would be based on the Nazis' final seizure of power. By 1932, the economic situation in the country had become terminal, as the Great Depression showed no signs of abating. German banks were on the brink of collapse and the political situation was in freefall. Then, that summer, new Reichstag elections were held. In these, the first since September 1930, the Nazis once again increased their support dramatically, doubling their vote to 37% and claiming 230 seats in the 608-seat Reichstag. Yet this was not an outright majority, and the centrist political parties were unwilling to do business with the Nazis if it meant Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany. As a consequence, a technocratic government was cobbled together, one which attempted to govern the country for a few months. However, this too proved ineffective, and new elections in November 1932 allowed Hitler to stoke fears amongst political centrists about the rise of the Communist Party of Germany. Thus, early in 1933, an agreement was reached between the Nazis, political centrists, and the leaders of the German business community that Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany in an effort to provide a more stable government and concretely address the economic situation. Unbeknownst to many of those who facilitated this, it was effectively a death sentence for the German Republic. Within weeks, Hitler used his new position to manufacture a political crisis, and used that to pass an Enabling Act, which allowed himself and his fellow Nazis to effectively rule by decree. The Weimar Republic was over, and the Nazi Third Reich had commenced. Rudolf Hess had become a significant figure within the Nazi Party during the late 1920s and early 1930s, based to a considerable extent on his personal relationship with Hitler and then on his promotion to a number of significant official positions within the party apparatus. However, this all paled into insignificance with his ascent following the Nazis' seizure of power in Germany in the spring of 1933, the extent of which must have surprised many within the Nazi senior hierarchy itself. Just weeks after the passage of the Enabling Act, Hitler appointed Hess as one of the 16 Reichsleiters who were created at this time. These Reichsleiters, or empire leaders, were effectively the senior members of the Nazi Party who made up the new governing body of Germany. Most of them were also individuals who were appointed to ministerial positions within the new German government, and this indeed was a distinction which was awarded to Hess shortly afterwards when, on the 1st of December 1933, he was made a minister without portfolio. This was a striking rise to official political office for an individual who had only first won a seat in the Reichstag in fresh elections which were held in fraudulent circumstances in March 1933, after Hitler had been appointed as Chancellor. However, all of these promotions in 1933 were dwarfed by the decision in the months following his ascent as Chancellor by Hitler to appoint Hess as Deputy Führer, or Deputy Leader of the Nazi Party, in mid-April 1933. The significance of this might have been lost on individuals such as Himmler, Goebbels, or another contender to become second in command of the government, Hermann Göring, at this stage. But if they were in any doubt as to Hess's seniority, this was displaced in September 1933 when Hitler decreed that Hess should cease to be termed a Reichsleiter and instead be addressed henceforth as the Deputy Führer in acknowledgement of his seniority amongst the other Nazi leaders. What this meant was that Hess was effectively Hitler's designated successor at this time, should anything happen to the Nazi leader. And it was in this capacity that he began acquiring an ever greater list of powers in the mid-1930s, monopolizing control over many aspects of Nazi policy relating to finances, health, and education. He was also responsible for the signing of legislation into law and for organizing political events throughout Germany, notably the massive Nazi rallies which were organized at the city of Nuremberg annually after their seizure of power in 1933. Hess also had extensive powers to monitor individuals who were deemed enemies of the party. As such, Hess's position in Germany expanded greatly in line with his appointment as Deputy Führer. We might ask at this point exactly how ideologically committed to the Nazi cause Hess was. Was he a virulent anti-Semite and German nationalist, or was he primarily a zealous follower of Hitler above all else? The answer is both. There is no doubt that Hess was personally committed in an almost fanatical fashion to Hitler, but there is also no disputing the fact that he was committed to the same ideological values as his master too. Hess, for instance, needed no convincing that Germany's recent history needed to be viewed through the prism of a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the country. For instance, he viewed the League of Nations, which had been set up to ensure international peace in the aftermath of the First World War, as an instrument of an international Jewish plot, and also perceived many of Germany's enemies, such as the Soviet Union, as being controlled by Jewish politicians. It is interesting to speculate, given his pronounced paranoid delusions in these respects, exactly to what extent Hess had influenced some of Hitler's views that he stated in Mein Kampf years earlier. Moreover, Hess was also passionately convinced of the need to rejuvenate Germany and of the racial superiority of the German people over others, such as the Slavs of Poland and Eastern Europe. While he may have been a zealous adherent of Hitler's, Hess did not need any convincing about the merits of the Nazis' racial ideology. Thank you to our sponsor Babbel, one of the world's #1 language learning apps that helps you become a lifelong learner, exploring new cultures and broadening your horizons. Right now, the leaves are changing, school is back in session, and it's the perfect time to start learning a new language. Whether you're studying abroad, dreaming of future travel, or just feeling the itch to learn something new, now's the time to get cozy and start speaking a new language with Babbel. If you want to learn a new language but find the prospect daunting, then Babbel can help. It prepares you for real-world conversations with short, 10-minute interactive lessons which are expertly crafted so you can have practical conversations about travel, business, and relationships. Plus, Babbel is scientifically proven to get you speaking in just 3 weeks. Which language would you like to learn? I'm learning French, and when I next ask for the bill in a restaurant in France, I'll know just what to say. Puis-je avoir l'addition, s'il vous plaît? If you want to learn a new language like me, just sign up with the link in the description today and get 60% off your subscription. Hess was far from alone in his ideological stance, and the first years of the Nazi regime's reign in Germany saw a series of virulently anti-Jewish laws introduced into the country. On the 15th of September 1935, the Reichstag, which had become little more than a showpiece designed to rubber stamp what Hitler and the other senior Nazi leaders had already decided upon, passed a series of legislation aimed at the persecution of Germany's 500,000 Jewish citizens. The Nuremberg Laws, as they became known, effectively robbed Germany's Jews of their rights in Germany. Indeed, depending on the bloodline of the country's Jews, they were officially deprived of their citizenship. Other elements of the legislation forbade Jews from marrying non-Jewish Germans, while Jews were also heavily regulated in terms of their ability to employ non-Jewish Germans. Numerous measures were also put in place to restrict the Jewish community's ability to conduct business. The Nuremberg Laws were the first major step in a series of escalating persecutory measures which the Nazi state would implement in the coming years, culminating in the pre-war period in the infamous Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, of November 1938, when thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues were attacked and tens of thousands of Jews were either killed, attacked, or detained. Because of his newfound position of seniority within Germany and his closeness with Hitler, Hess would also have been central to deliberations in the mid-1930s around German rearmament. One of the most significant terms of the Treaty of Versailles that had brought the First World War to an end was that Germany was restricted to an army, henceforth of no more than 100,000 troops, while it was completely prohibited from having an air force and anything other than a token navy. The Weimar government had exceeded these figures by keeping tens of thousands of troops enlisted in an unofficial capacity, but the German army remained small throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. The Nazis quickly set about reversing this situation, arguing on the international stage that Germany had been humiliated for long enough and that it was only right that it should be allowed to move on from the war which had ended 15 years earlier. Berlin made an announcement in early 1935 that it would begin recruiting hundreds of thousands of men into a new German army, while a German air force, to be called the Luftwaffe, was also to be established. Thus, within a short period of time, the Nazis began rearming their country, and in the spring of 1936, they moved troops into the Rhineland of Western Germany, a region which they were prohibited from placing troops in under the terms of Versailles. It was the beginning of the march to a war of revenge, which Hitler had desired since 1918. Hess's role in German affairs continued to expand as this rearmament process was underway. In 1933, he had been placed in charge of establishing the Volksdeutscher Rat, meaning the Council of Ethnic Germans, a body which was responsible for reaching out to ethnic German communities living outside the borders of Germany, notably in places like Austria, the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and Western Poland. Some of these regions had formed part of Germany prior to the First World War, and the council was established with a view to improving Nazi relations with the German communities here in advance of reacquiring direct control of these territories, whether through diplomatic means or through war. Hess oversaw the management of the council and efforts within it to disrupt the politics of Germany's neighbours and agitate for return of lands lost in 1918. He was also directly involved during these years in the drafting of the Nuremberg Laws and other legislation aimed against groups such as Romani people and Jehovah's Witnesses, who the Nazis were also hateful of. He also acted increasingly as Hitler's representative in negotiations and conferences with the heads of the German business community, notably the presidents of companies such as IG Farben, Krupps, and others which were deeply in league with the Nazis. Hess was Hitler's right-hand man as the march to war escalated in the late 1930s. As we have seen, the regime had begun rearming in 1935. This escalated in early 1938 as Berlin began to try to reclaim lands which it had lost in 1918, and other lands which the Nazis wanted to form into a greater Germany through aggressive diplomacy. This had been underway in many ways since 1933 in Austria, where the Austrian Nazi Party had attempted to undermine successive governments in Vienna. A different form of Austrian fascism emerged to fend off Germany's efforts to subsume the country, but by early 1938, German interference had become so intense that a referendum was declared on the matter of uniting the country with Germany. Preempting the result of this, Hitler ordered the German army into Austria in mid-March 1938. No major violence occurred, but the measure ensured that the union of the two countries, known as the Anschluss, was voted through easily days later. Thereafter, Hitler began pressing claims to much of Czechoslovakia, a country which was effectively annexed in two intervals in late 1938 and the spring of 1939, as Britain and France tried to avoid a new war by appeasing Hitler. However, when Czechoslovakia was fully dismembered in March 1939, it was clear that any further act of aggression would mean war. Thus, when the Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France responded by declaring war in turn on Germany. The Second World War had commenced. Hess's roles changed substantially with the outbreak of the conflict. He became increasingly involved, for instance, in the measures being taken to organize the occupation of Poland in the autumn and winter of 1939, following a swift, successful military campaign in September and early October. Much of this revolved around identifying the country's 3.5 million Jewish people and preparing for their persecution under German rule. For instance, Hess was responsible for overseeing the establishment of a registry of all Polish Jews, and also the adoption of policies which would effectively commence the creation of Lebensraum in Poland by stripping the current inhabitants of the region of their rights. Thus, Hess's sphere of activity increased to include administrative responsibilities in Poland. Much of this was against his own inclinations, and Hess wanted to be more active in combat. The Deputy Führer had a lifelong interest in aviation, having signed up to join the nascent German Air Force in 1918 towards the end of the First World War. He had subsequently learned to fly in the late 1920s and participate in aviation races throughout the 1930s. Consequently, when Hitler initiated the war in September 1939, Hess had sought to join the Luftwaffe and to fly active missions in the war. Yet Hitler had forbidden this, stating that Hess was too important a figure within the regime to risk his life flying standard aviation missions. This prohibition was later reduced to a one-year ban, but when Hess finally took to the skies during the war, it would be for an altogether stranger mission than he had envisaged in 1939. The Second World War was a slow conflict at first. Poland was conquered by the Nazis in a matter of weeks, and thereafter there were months of inaction on all sides as Britain and France tried to rearm as quickly as possible. This belated effort on their part proved costly, and when Hitler finally ordered the German Wehrmacht westwards in the spring of 1940, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and France were all conquered in a matter of a few months. Thus, by the late summer that year, the Nazi state stood in control of virtually all of Central Europe and much of Western Europe, while those states in these regions which remained outside of Nazi control, such as Italy, Switzerland and Spain, were either allies or neutral in the war. Only Britain stood against Germany, and that late summer and autumn, a massive campaign began by land and sea to bomb the country and choke off its resources to force London to submit. This latter campaign, which has come to be known by various terms such as the Blitz, meaning the bombing of British cities by the German Air Force, the Battle of the North Atlantic, to refer to the German Navy's efforts to strangle Britain's supply lines by attacking its merchant navy at sea, and the Battle of Britain more broadly, would provide the backdrop to one of the defining episodes of Rudolf Hess's life. During the course of 1940 and early 1941, Hess and Hitler's relationship began to deteriorate. This was not because of a major incident or falling out between the pair. Rather, it was simply that Hess was deprived of the personal contact and interaction with the Führer, which so much of his career and position had been based on since the mid-1920s. The reason for this was Hitler was now largely basing himself out of military compounds in Germany and Poland as he prepared for a vast invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. As he spent more time absent from Berlin and Munich, where Hess continued his administrative work, the pair interacted less and less. It was at this particular juncture that Hess began making plans to engage in one of the most peculiar acts of the entire Second World War. From the early autumn of 1940, Hess began initiating contact with the Duke of Hamilton, with a view to having him act as an intermediary with King George VI of Britain. Hess believed they could collectively initiate peace proceedings between Nazi Germany and Britain. Hess's motives in doing so, which were kept secret from Hitler and all the other Nazi leaders, and which were effectively treasonous as a result, seemed to have been born out of his concern regarding the feasibility of invading the Soviet Union without first ending the war with Britain. Hess's efforts on this issue continued through the autumn and winter of 1940. By this time, he had come to believe that King George was effectively opposed to the British government, led by the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, concerning the commitment to continue the war with Germany. As such, he believed it would be possible to use Hamilton as an intermediary with the king and establish peace with Britain. To that end, in November 1940, Hess began making preparations to fly to Britain himself, piloting a Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter-bomber plane. As part of this, he began customizing one of these planes to increase its fuel load and fit it with equipment he might need for his mission. And then, on the 10th of May 1941, Rudolf Hess, the deputy leader of Nazi Germany, set off on a solo flight from Germany over the North Sea towards Britain. Just over 5 hours later, having been detected by the RAF and running short of fuel, he parachuted out of his plane in the skies over southern Scotland at 23:06 p.m. local time. Hess later described his pride in having successfully made it to Britain on his mission. He didn't last long unhindered though. Less than an hour after landing, he was apprehended and detained south of Glasgow. Following his initial detention, Hess claimed to be a German officer called Alfred Horn. Posing as this individual, he then requested to be allowed to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. It was only when this request was granted and he met with Hamilton the following day that Hess revealed his true identity and disclosed the purpose of his mission. The Deputy Führer must have been surprised when Hamilton did not have as positive a reaction as Hess had been led to believe he would have to his mission. Instead, Hamilton headed south to disclose what had occurred and to confer with Churchill in London. Here it was determined that Hamilton would meet with Hess again at Buchanan Castle in Stirlingshire in Scotland, where he had been detained. Thus, a second meeting was organised, at which Hess detailed his proposals for peace. Hess believed a mutually beneficial dispensation could be arrived at if Britain made peace with Germany. Through this, Germany was to be given free rein to rule the European continent, while Britain would be allowed to retain its independence and also control over its vast overseas empire. As Hess saw it, it was a logical mutual agreement for the British and Germans, two of the racially advanced European nations, to come to. His captors, however, disagreed, and it became clear to Hess in the days that followed that his mission had been completely in vain. Meanwhile, back in Germany, news of Hess's unsanctioned mission had reached Hitler by midday on the 11th of May, just 12 hours after Hess had parachuted to the ground in Scotland. It was delivered via a letter Hess had prepared prior to his departure. Despite Hess outlining his reasons for his mission and trying to justify them on the basis that they were in Germany's best interests and favourable to the war effort, Hitler reacted furiously. He quickly stripped Hess of all his positions, abolishing the position of Deputy Führer and assigning his duties to Martin Bormann, another senior administrator within the regime. In an effort to manage the political fallout, a bizarre program of arresting and persecuting astrologers and faith healers whom Hess had been known to consult was also initiated in order to suggest that the Deputy Führer had acted as he had after being influenced by occultists of some kind. Thus, Hess was completely disowned by the Nazi regime as a result of his mission. In Britain, his situation was equally dispiriting. After learning that his mission had been futile, he was briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London before being sent to Mitchett Place in Surrey, a fortified mansion designated as Camp Z, where he would spend nearly a whole year under house arrest. Hess's first years in detention in Britain would see the course of the war begin to shift dramatically. When he first flew into Scotland in the early summer of 1941, the Nazis had reached a position of enormous strength, having conquered a vast part of Europe from the Bay of Biscay in western France east to Poland and the western parts of what is now Ukraine, and from the northern stretches of Norway south to the Balkans. Campaigns were also underway to conquer Greece and North Africa in conjunction with Hitler's ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. However, just 6 weeks after Hess landed in Britain, Hitler initiated a vast invasion of the Soviet Union. At first, this went very well for Germany, and it seemed that the Nazis would soon be able to force the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to cede most of Eastern Europe to them as well. But that winter, the German Wehrmacht began to meet with more determined resistance in Russia outside the cities of Moscow and Leningrad. Then, in December 1941, the United States entered the war against the Nazis after it was attacked by Hitler's other major ally, the Empire of Japan. Thus, in 1942, ominous reversals of fortune began for Hitler and his accomplices, as the campaigns in both North Africa and on the Eastern Front in Russia began to shift in the favour of the Allies. Things were faring no better for Hess in Britain. At Mitchett Place in Surrey, he was under house arrest. His circumstances here were comparatively favourable to those of an average German prisoner of war in Britain, and certainly better than those of the average prisoner of war in German custody on the continent. For instance, Hess was allowed to move freely about the rather pleasant surroundings of much of the mansion house and was able to write home to his family in Germany. The major deprivations were that he could not listen to the radio or read the newspapers, and the mansion and grounds were guarded by over 150 armed soldiers. This information blackout ensured that Hess did not receive any news about the course of the war, which he might be able to use to manipulate his situation. Yet, despite the rather pleasant circumstances in which he was imprisoned, Hess's psychological state was deteriorating throughout the spring and early summer of 1942, as he claimed that secret forces with special psychic powers were attempting to control figures like Churchill. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Nazi in Hess associated these secret forces with a Jewish plot. There is debate to this day, though, as to whether or not Hess was feigning his psychological deterioration. One of the terms of the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of War Prisoners stipulated that those who were mentally incapacitated had to be repatriated to their home nation and Hess was possibly trying to get back to Germany through this loophole. In mid-June 1942, Hess's situation changed considerably. Early on the morning of the 16th, he attempted to commit suicide, or at least make it seem as though he were attempting to take his own life, by jumping over a railing of a staircase at Mitchett Place and falling onto a stone floor below. The fall didn't kill him, but he did fracture his left leg. Thus, he was forced to use crutches for weeks thereafter, and a decision was taken based on his deteriorating mental health and increasing assertions that he was being poisoned at the Mansion House to send him to Maendiff Court Hospital in southeastern Wales on the 26th of June 1942. Hess would spend the remaining 3 years of the war confined here. His circumstances didn't really improve while there. The surroundings were certainly less pleasant, though as the war continued to go favourably for the Allies, Hess was increasingly allowed access to the newspapers and given a radio. He complained regularly of suffering from a wide range of ailments related to his internal organs, complaints which his physicians, who at first were unaware that Hess was a lifelong hypochondriac, might have taken seriously at first, but soon learned to ignore. Thus did the former Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany spend the last 3 years of the Second World War. By this time, the war was heading towards an inexorable conclusion. In late 1942, one of the most significant clashes of the entire conflict had been fought between the Germans and the Russians for control of the southern Russian city of Stalingrad. It had ended in the first disastrous German defeat of the entire war. Then, in the spring of 1943, with a large injection of US personnel and supplies, the Western Allies were able to gain victory in the North Africa campaign, forcing the Italians and Germans out of both Libya and Tunisia. That summer, they followed up on this by opening a southern front in Sicily in southern Italy. However, this proved to be a more limited new front compared to the one which was opened in Western Europe in the summer of 1944 following the D-Day landings in Normandy. Within weeks, the Allies were able to liberate Paris, just as the Russians advanced into Poland. By the end of 1944, despite a last, desperate counteroffensive by Hitler in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, that December, the Western Allies were preparing to invade the Rhineland early in 1945, as the Russians began their military build-up in Poland in advance of invading Eastern Germany. The war was effectively over. It was simply a race to see who would capture Berlin first. Back in Britain at Maendiff Court Hospital, Hess was not responding well to news of developments on the continent. On the 4th of February 1945, he attempted to commit suicide for a second time by stabbing himself with a blunt bread knife. By that time, he was aware that the Russians were advancing on Berlin from the east of the country, and the British, Americans and other Western Allies were attempting to make their descent on the German capital as well before the war ended. Perhaps it is a sign of his mental decline that Hess believed the bread knife could ever inflict a sufficient enough wound to kill himself, and the surface gash required little more than 2 stitches afterwards. Thereafter, he engaged in a hunger strike. However, this too was abandoned when he was informed that he would be force-fed if he continued on that path. By now, the British government was determined to keep Hess alive for the purposes of having him appear at the major war crimes trial which was being planned for the Nazi leadership once the conflict was over. They were sorely in need of senior members of the regime to stand trial as the war drew to a conclusion. As with Berlin surrounded by the Russians in late April 1945, Hitler killed himself on the 30th, and his designated successor, Goebbels, followed suit a day later on the 1st of May. Thus, although he had been in custody in Britain for 4 years by the time the war in Europe officially came to an end on the 8th of May 1945, Hess would be one of the senior defendants at the planned War Crimes Tribunal. Hess was repatriated to Germany in the autumn of 1945 for the purposes of standing trial before the International Military Tribunal, which had been established to oversee the war crimes trials at the city of Nuremberg after the war. He was to be tried along with the remaining senior members of the Nazi regime in the headline first trial. Individuals such as the head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor for much of the war, Hermann Göring, the head of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, the War Economy Minister and Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, and the head of the General Government of occupied Poland, where the Holocaust of millions of Europe's Jews had primarily been carried out after Hess's flight to Scotland in May 1941, Hans Frank. There were 23 men involved in all in the trial. Generally, these individuals were to be tried with having incited the war, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and broad violations of the laws governing warfare. The trial, watched intently by the world's media, would be held at Nuremberg from November 1945 onwards and lasted nearly 11 months. Hess was in poor physical condition when he arrived to Nuremberg in the autumn of 1945. He weighed little more than 10 stone and was paranoid that his captors in Britain had been poisoning his food. As a result, he had brought samples of what he had been fed with him to Germany with the goal of presenting them as evidence of his mistreatment in Britain. But these were immediately confiscated. When the time for the trial came, he started to claim that the amnesia he was suffering from already in Britain had worsened. Moreover, he refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the court, claiming that the entire tribunal was effectively a show trial, at the end of which he expected himself and all of his fellow defendants to be found guilty and executed. He was wrong in this. While Göring and several others who had a clear and direct hand in the Holocaust of the continent's Jewish people and other groups such as the Romani were indeed sentenced to death, others were spared. Hess was amongst them. While he was deemed to be guilty of having helped to incite the war, his defense lawyer argued that Hess could not be held responsible for the Holocaust and other war crimes which had largely occurred after Hess made his flight to Scotland and was imprisoned. Accordingly, he was sentenced to life in prison, but spared the death penalty. Hess began serving his sentence at Spandau Prison in western Berlin in July 1947. He was confined there with 6 others who had been placed on trial with him at Nuremberg, including Speer, the foreign minister Konstantin von Neurath, and the 2 senior heads of the German Navy under the Nazis, Karl von Donitz and Erich Raeder. The prisoners were held under difficult circumstances early on, with strict rules forbidding them from conversing with one another and severe limitations on their access to writing materials. As time went by, these restrictions were loosened. Hess, however, remained a broken figure. He continued to believe his food was being poisoned, refused to have any visitors, and was known to cry out in his sleep. Despite this situation, he continued to be confined at Spandau, as an assessment in 1957 deemed him well enough not to warrant being sent to a psychiatric unit. Moreover, the prison was gradually emptying. 4 of Hess's fellow Nazi prisoners were released in the mid-1950s, having either served their sentences or on the grounds of severe ill health. The final 2 others, Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach, who had been the Nazi governor of occupied Vienna, were released together on the 30th of September 1966, having both served their 20-year sentences. Thus, henceforth, Spandau Prison, which had 600 cells, housed Rudolf Hess as its sole prisoner from 1966 onwards. 3 years after Speer and von Schirach left Spandau, things began to change slightly. Although for many years he had been in contact with his wife Ilse and son Wolf, as well as his daughter-in-law Andrea, whom he had never met in person, he had repeatedly declined their requests to visit him. But following a period of illness in 1969, when he was moved briefly to a medical hospital to treat a perforated ulcer, he relented and allowed them to visit. It was the first time he had seen his wife and son since 1941. Thereafter, many individuals began to petition for his release, particularly as he began to suffer from many different ailments, including prostate cancer. However, these would all be declined on the grounds that Hess had never shown any remorse for his actions and was still a committed anti-Semite. His unwillingness to feign some remorse to advance the case for his release was just one aspect of Hess's unrelentingly peculiar approach to those who visited him. For instance, when historians showed up to interview him in an effort to better understand why he had flown into Britain in 1941 without telling anyone in the Nazi leadership what he was doing, Hess would tell them he had been inspired to do so by supernatural forces which visited him in a dream. Rudolf Hess was found dead on the 17th of August 1987 in a room in the garden at Spandau Prison, which had been converted to allow him a summer reading room. He had apparently hanged himself using an extension cord which he had strung over the latch of one of the windows of the room. Although a suicide note was found on his person, and the Allied bodies, which had been charged with overseeing Spandau Prison for 4 decades, quickly ruled his death a suicide, some doubts were raised at the time. Hess, after all, was in his early 90s by that time, and many people believed he could not possibly have managed to hang himself. However, there seems little reason to think otherwise. Why would any other power with access to Spandau have suddenly decided to kill him after 40 years of being imprisoned there? Additionally, it was noted at the time that Hess's mental state had never been good, and he had previously attempted suicide at Spandau in 1977. Following his death, Spandau Prison, of which he had been the sole prisoner for 21 years, was demolished to prevent it becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Rudolf Hess was in many ways the last of the senior Nazis to die. Rudolf Hess is one of the strangest of all the senior members of the Nazi regime to assess. While many studies have often commented on his personal relationship with Hitler, there is also no doubting he was an ideological Nazi, one who was both a committed right-wing nationalist and an anti-Semite, while also espousing the racial hierarchy which allowed the Nazis to have no compunctions about mass murdering millions of Jews, Poles, Romani, Russians, and other peoples across Europe during the Second World War. Moreover, he was absolutely central to the operations of the party once the Nazis seized power in 1933, overseeing the passage of legislation and even drafting parts of notorious ones such as the Nuremberg Laws. While subsequent events would complicate his reputation, there is no doubting that Hess was every bit as committed to the Nazi ideology as Hitler, Himmler, or Goebbels. Indeed, we will never know how much he might have influenced some of Hitler's own ideas as he was drafting Mein Kampf at Landsberg Prison in 1924. Despite all of this, Hess is more difficult to assess than figures like Himmler and Goebbels. This is all because of the events of May 1941, when Hess decided to fly on a solo mission to Britain with the goal of initiating peace talks between Britain and Nazi Germany. His mission was a complete failure, but because of it, many people have judged Hess less harshly than some of his associates within the Nazi leadership. But there seems to be little reason to do so. Hess's actions might have been driven by his declining mental health, but they were nevertheless quite in line with Nazi ideology. The Deputy Führer was not trying to bring about peace in Europe through his mission. He was simply trying to ensure that Britain was no longer an adversary before Germany went to war with Russia. Given the apocalyptic plans which the Nazis had for Eastern Europe, had they defeated the Soviet Union, there is little sense in finding some redeeming quality in Hess's efforts to simply shore up Germany's western borders in order to more effectively wage war in the East. Moreover, Hess never showed any remorse for his actions and remained committed to much of the Nazis' ideology down to his death, more than 4 decades after the war ended. He lived and died a full-blooded Nazi throughout his life, and neither his complicated psychology nor his actions in 1941 changed that. What do you think of Rudolf Hess? Should he be judged in the same way that the other senior members of the Nazi regime have been? Or do his curious actions in heading to Scotland in 1941 to initiate peace talks exonerate him to some extent of his crimes? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.